Welcome to Chebacco Chats, Season 3, Episode 14. I'm Jenna Jandro, Communications and Engagement Manager at MDI Historical Society, and your host today. Chebacco Chats uses a webinar format, so while you can see and hear us, we cannot see and hear our audience. We do invite you to ask questions and send comments using the chat and Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Feel free to ask whenever the inquiry arises. However, I will only address questions at the end of the program. Today, I'm speaking to Tim Garrity, who was formerly Executive Director and Historian for MDI Historical Society. He has contributed to every issue of Chebacco from 2011 to the present, including an upcoming article in the 2023 edition about one of the worst cases of mutiny and mass murder in American maritime history. Tim wrote about the history of the Stone Barn Farm in our 2022 edition of Chebacco. And of course, if you're familiar with Chebacco Chats, you recognize Tim as former host. Now retired, he lives in Blue Hill with his wife, Lynn, where his chief occupation is renovating their 1820 farmhouse. I'd also like to welcome Renee Duncan from Maine Coast Heritage Trust, the nonprofit conservation organization that now stewards the 128 acres and buildings of the Stone Barn Farm. Renee is the MDI Regional Outreach Manager and Stone Barn Farm Steward. Welcome to Chebacco Chats, Tim and Renee. Thank you for being here. I am going to start with a question for Tim. Now, I know that you're no stranger to the Stone Barn Farms Preserve, having hiked its 2-mile network of trails. I know you're an avid outdoorsman. So could you tell me about the Stone Barn Farm and kind of the character of this place and your experiences there? Let's start there.
Well, the Stone Barn Farm, well, first of all, Jenna, thanks for having us. This is really fun to come back to this format and to share this session with Renee. Renee and I worked together about 12 years ago as park rangers in Acadia, so it's great to be back. And to your question about the Stone Barn Farm, it's one of many places in Acadia where you can really get a sense of the history of the place just by, with a little bit of work of your imagination, of peeling back layers of time and see into the past just based on what you can observe today. And the Stone Barn is a place that's always been subject to revision. It's been covered in ice. It's been hunted by Native American people. It's been farmed by colonial settlers. It has seen its transition from farming multiple different crops and products to just being a dairy farm. And today it stands as a refuge against encroaching development, preserved by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust.
And what was the impetus for you to write a history of this place? Where did that idea first arise in you?
Well, usually when authors come up with an idea for Chebacco, they're set with a theme and then they have their own imagination and resources to call on. But this was completely different. This was actually commissioned by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. Sophie Nelson contacted us and asked if we would research the history of the place so that our this history could be used in promoting it as a site for visitors, and also I think as part of the fundraising campaign to endow the place to preserve its future. So I worked with Sophie, served as my editor for an initial version of this, and I worked with people like Misha Moitar and Doug McMullen, who had lots of resources. And I also talked with agricultural historian Todd Little-Siebold at College of the Atlantic, who was just a font of knowledge about MDI's early farming history. And then the Heritage Trust agreed to let us adapt this article for the 2022 issue of Chebacco.
That's fantastic, on the initiative of the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, and also that they have allowed us to reprint that in Chebacco. So you mentioned that this space was once under ice, and I think one of the interesting parts of your article was the discussion of the geological history of this place. Could you tell me a little bit more about what the land features can tell us about it, and explain to us some of its prehistory?
I think this is this aspect of MDI history is the one I find most interesting. It requires a work of the imagination on the part of the reader. You have to imagine this island covered with a sheet of ice a mile high. It's hard to conceive of something that's high. So ice covering the island, what, 3 times the height of Cadillac Mountain, and ice of those dimensions, wide and high, is also very heavy. It's so heavy that it pressed the land down into the sea and plowed forward, carving away everything in its path. And evidence of it can still be seen in its geology. Maybe you have the next slide available. Does that show Dwayne Braun's study? Yeah, this one here. You see the red lines on the map on the left. The stone barn is identified right to the left at the center of the screen. But those red lines indicate places where every year the glacier advanced, pushing a load of gravel in front of it and then receded. And then it came back and it pushed in. So like the kind of pile that you would see at the end of the winter when the snowplow is continually plowed up a gravel road. That's called a glacial moraine, and the Stone Barn farm sits on top of one of those moraines. And the weight of the ice was so heavy that it pressed the ground into the sea. And when the glacier receded, the ground remained submerged for thousands of years. And in that time, marine sediments fell to the bottom, and it provided what today is ideal soil for farming. So the presence of the Stone Barn farm as a farm itself was sort of predetermined by its glacial history.
And can you tell us, during your research, what did you learn about this area's history of ownership?
Well, we first have to acknowledge the Wabanaki presence. And just as the sediment made this ideal for farming and the growth of agricultural products, it also is set in a place where you can again see for yourself that it is a place where there's tremendous abundance throughout the year. The Native Americans could hunt moose, deer, and bear, and muskrat, and going down to the marsh that leads up the Northeast Creek to the sea. All along the way, they could find bird life and eggs, and then in the ocean itself, abundant food that it's hard to imagine in the present day the degree of abundance that was present before the arrival of Europeans. So it was a very rich area for Native American people to come and make a living. With the arrival of colonial settlers, we know that early maps show us that Eben Salisbury acquired the place in the late 18th century. And you can see the juncture of the creek and its tributary and Eben Salisbury. And there was a change of ownership. We lose track of exactly what happened, but eventually it comes into the hands of Thomas Paine around 1819. And he owned the place for about 20 years before turning it over to Richard Paine. And Richard Paine and his family lived there until about 1908. And what you see here in this image is not a stone barn, but the series of outbuildings that were connected to the house that's still present, sort of a big house, little house, back house barn sort of arrangement. And the while the barn now is gone, it's been replaced with the dairy barn, uh, which is early 20th century, and a carriage house. And the carriage house you can see today was made for vehicles that don't back up very easily. You would bring in a horse or ox-drawn cart in one door and out the other. I guess the Payne family is pretty notable in 19th century history. Richard Payne served in the American Civil War, and along with many young men from the Emory district. And I think we should especially consider his young wife, Sophia, who stayed on the farm while Richard was serving in Louisiana. Sophia had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and she was pregnant with another child while Richard was gone. And in her care, she had to manage a farm that produced a small crop of potatoes, 100 pounds of butter, and 5 tons of hay. And in addition to her children, she had to deal with 2 cows, 2 oxen, 8 sheep, and a pig. And you can imagine what that life must have been like for her. Richard was sick and in the hospital for most of his service in the Union Army, while Sophia had this to contend with. Shortly after Richard returned home in 1863, Sophia died, and Richard stayed on and continued to manage the farm, outliving 3 more wives. I think we talk about the terrible mortality of the Civil War. It was more than matched by mortality of women who had the kind of responsibilities that the Paynes had in this time. So it was a difficult life. I think we often have a sort of a romanticized view of what it was like to live on a farm where all was peace and quiet, and it was pretty tough.
And then we have ownership moving on to a couple of great stonemasons who did some pretty significant work. Could you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, so you're talking about the Shea family, and the barn itself is the eye catcher, right? That's what everybody drives onto the crooked road, slams on the brakes to see the stone barn, and why it's such an iconic architectural landmark on Mount Desert Island. Well, the Shea brothers were masons, and you can see some of their work today in the Bar Harbor Town Hall, right across from Hannaford. That once was the Bar Harbor High School. A lot of their stonework is there. And also in the turrets, the administration building of College of the Atlantic. They did some of the stonework for that structure as well. And the Historic Preservation Commission that evaluated this property thought that perhaps the stone barn was meant to model the Shea's prowess as masons, which is valid. It's a very unusual and very attractive structure. And they owned the place for a number of years and eventually started to rent it out to other families, and particularly the one I think you're going to ask me about next.
Yes, you're correct. So we have some photos here that were included in Chebacco that were from a photo album by Frank Gray. Could you tell us a little bit about Frank Gray?
Well, what you're seeing here is 10-year-old Frank Gray. We had a project with the Historical Society called History Harvest, in which we interviewed all kinds of people, and especially community elders like Frank, who's this wonderful man. And he described his life growing up on the site of the stone barn. It was then known as the Shea Farm. And he tells a story of Thanksgiving in the 1930s, 37, I think, and of 2 of his friends who were playing in the pond down the hill and on the ice, and one of them broke through, or both of them broke through and were under the ice in 6 feet of water. They were barely rescued by a neighbor who describes that one of the boys was so full of water and so frozen stiff that he ran up the hill with the boy on his shoulder, and as he was jaunting along, performed a form of CPR on the young guy. And one of Frank's vivid memories is these boys in front of the fire getting stripped down and getting put into warm clothing, barely surviving. Frank's story is corroborated by reports in the Bar Harbor Times that also thought that it was a very significant event and a near miss for these young people. And you can see young Frank on the right in this image, standing next to some very tall sunflowers, which became an eye catcher for visitors and passersby. It became a character. These beautiful sunflowers became a characteristic of the farm.
And when they were farming at this time, how would they be transporting their goods around the island?
Well, in this era, there was trucks. You know, they were dealing with garden farming that would take these to different markets. But also, I think at this time, much of New England's agricultural products were coming from the Midwest by train, because in the Midwest they could just grow products more cheaply and more profitably, and New England farms turned to dairy farming. And that's why you see that the stone barn is very specifically a dairy barn. It's not a general purpose barn. It's meant for production of dairy products. And that was survivable up until late in the 20th century, when many farms just couldn't make it economically. It just wasn't viable.
So after the Shays and their renters, we have the Owenses, and we are going to spend some time on the Owenses. So could you tell me about that great couple?
Well, Harry and Cindy Owen arrived and purchased the farm in 1963. And they both held other jobs, but continued to work the farm, growing farm products and selling it to local restaurants. But the duration of Harry and Cindy's ownership, their determination to preserve the place, their appreciation of its beauty is the characteristic, their obstinance, when they could have made a tremendous profit selling the farm to developers, where we could have tract houses and paved roads all over that place. They instead partnered with the Maine Coast Heritage Trust to preserve it. And I'll let Renee address that more. But the first inkling we have that this is coming is found in a 1980, so 42 years ago, a 1980 survey in which Harry said that the encroaching suburbia was a disaster, and that the place needed to be preserved for the future. And you kind of read in his determination that that earliest sense that he wasn't going to let this place get developed. He worked with the MCHT to first create a conservation easement in 2001, then put the home and the buildings on the National Register of Historic Places to increase their appreciation. And then in 2019, MCHT purchased the property from Harry Owen. Cindy had at this point passed away. And then the Maine Coast Heritage Trust raised funds to purchase the property, renovate it and stabilize its structure, and endow it so that people like Renee could be present there in an ongoing role to assure its continuing stewardship.
Which is wonderful. I'm going to insert just another story here for a moment, because I wanted to share with our audience that there's another piece of the Stone Barn Farm history that can be seen on the island. The 1928 Ford Model A Huckster that was previously owned by Harry Owen is part of the Seal Cove Auto Museum collection. It is a fully operating vehicle that they have there. And I had the great pleasure of driving it at one time. So I wanted to tell everyone to go check that out as well during their season in the summer. Now, this is a painting by Rock Caivano of the Stone Barn Farm, and it's going to transition us into our talk with Renee. Tim, I want to thank you so much for providing some background where we learned a little bit about the past of the Stone Barn Farm, and now we're going to switch to the present and the future, and this is where Maine Coast Heritage Trust and Renee Duncan come in. Thanks for being here, Renee. My first question for you is, one of your roles is as the Stone Barn Farm steward. What does that mean to you to be a steward of a place, including its history?
Well, I think simply put, it's caring for the land and engaging the neighbors and the community to join alongside in that caring. I'm relatively new to the Stone Barn Farm story, so I'm doing a lot of listening right now, not a lot of telling, and I'm learning a lot. I started in May, and yeah, it's just being at the place and knowing, and I'm learning the city of the soil and who the neighbors are and where the deer bed down in the field and what happens to Northeast Creek when we get a lot of rain, and where the turtles cross the road in the fall. I think there are lots of details that are compiling together to form this kind of broader understanding of what's happening at this place, and that's all important to taking care of it more fully. So yeah, it's a lot of listening. I mow the grass, I maintain the trails, I make sure there's clear signage, and I've also inherited the oversight of the barn renovation project.
So let's talk about that. What is going on at the Stone Barn Farm now, and what are plans for future?
So most people are kind of in the know now that there's a new parking lot that's for 35 cars, and we'll keep it open throughout the winter. We've been maintaining trails, like I noted. And we're planning a outreach schedule for next year. So we'll be hosting some programming at Stone Barn Farm for people to come and be on the land. And one of the bigger projects right now is the barn renovation. So probably as people have driven by, they've noticed the steel out on the lawn, and that's slowly being pieced into the barn. Big posts and steel posts and beams. Intended to reinforce the structure inside. So it will take some of the stress off of the stone walls. And also a part of this phase will be replacing the roof. And the same sort of happenings are going on in the sheep shed, which is the slanted space right off of the main part of the barn. So this is intended to also not change the exterior of the barn, but rather just make it so that it's safe and ensured to be here for many, many years to come.
So I received in the Q&A a note that some people, at least one person, is having a little bit of difficulty hearing us. So if we can, now that, sorry that I only give you this note now, but I'm going to try to speak up a little bit myself. And they also said that Harry is with them. So hello, Harry. I missed a little bit, a photo of him back here. So I would like to just focus on that for a second and express our thanks to Harry and Cindy for their work on conserving this space. So Renee, I went to this image of the beams inside the barn, which is going to preserve its interior and make it safe for people to be inside and experience that space. And then this next image is kind of showing that as a schematic, I believe. And this is all part of a larger kind of management plan and strategy that Maine Coast Heritage Trust is putting together.
Yeah, so we're working on our management plan now. We've been gathering information since at least spring, if not longer, before me. So there's an online survey where people can weigh in about how they wish to see the land maintained, and offer ideas for programming in the barn and on the space, in the space. And yeah, that's on our website. So please feel free to keep giving feedback on our management plan. And that guides the next 5 years of how we care for the place.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Renee, for giving us a little bit of a glimpse into what's going to happen there. I know personally that I've enjoyed spending some time on those trails with some good friends on walks, especially during COVID, when being outside was where we were getting together. One question for you, Renee, is have you found anything during your rebuilding or preservation, or now that Maine Coast Heritage Trust has acquired this space, has anything emerged that you found kind of fun or interesting, or just curious?
Yeah, so there have been some sort of interesting little pieces here and there. We dug footers for those steel posts, those 4 steel posts that are in the barn. And when you turn over the concrete, all of that concrete underneath it was beach stone. So you can see all these little seashells and sand and beach stone that's compacted for underneath the concrete. There's also been wheels that we pulled out of the sheep shed from 4 feet below the ground. And then also, we didn't see a photo today, but there was once a silo connected to the barn. And with heavy machines moving back and forth in front of the barn right now, if you look to the right of the barn, you can see like a concrete ring that was the foundation for that silo. You can see it just right there. So yeah, there are layers that we're uncovering, and will be interesting for people to see.
I'm sure there will be more. We'd love to hear about anything that you uncovered there. Tim, we got a question about, or for either of you actually, if you have any history on the pine plantation. It seems that the trees were planted in very straight rows. Tim, you're muted, sorry.
Yes, these probably, as best we can tell, these were planted in the 1980s. They're and that whole forest there is almost entirely planted at the same time. You can see all the trees are uniform height, and it was time where agricultural land was being taken out of production and turned to the production of forest products. So if you walk through those woods, you'll see these pines planted in perfectly straight lines, and with only interrupted by the occasional wolf pine, that being a tree that had its origins in an open field with time to spread its limbs out, and until it was encroached on by other underbrush that became a forest. I don't have the specifics on that, but Todd Little-Sebold suggested it was likely some sort of government program that provided a reward for the production of forest products.
Okay, if there are any other questions, we can take those at this time. I did get a note for Renee, and I will follow up with you about one of our audience members having a donation also from Harry Owens in the past. He seems like he's a heck of a guy. And let's see what else we've got here. Oh, you mentioned the Emory district. There were several districts, as I recall. Can you explain the district phenomenon? It's coming from Bill Horner.
Hey, Bill. The Emory district got its name from the Emory family, whose name is everywhere on the deeds around that property. And I think it speaks to a time when when life was a little more local than it is now. No consolidated high school, but what, 30 local schools, lots of neighborhoods within fairly easy walking distance that all acquired their name. I think it's true of a place like Astaku above Northeast Harbor. It was a place where people could interact relatively easy if you were on foot. And the Emorys had very strong family presence in that area all throughout the 19th century. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but Richard Payne's first wife was Sophia Emory, a daughter of one of the families in that area.
Great. So we have a couple more questions that came in. So we'll try to squeeze those in here. First off, Renee, could you talk about access to Northeast Creek and its potentials?
Yeah, so if you look at a map of the preserve, you can see that it doesn't matter how you take it, but like about a mile around the trail, especially if you take the wagon path, then one of the paths ends right into Northeast Creek, and it's this beautiful view of the creek looking north. Oftentimes you can see waterfowl there, and that's something that we need to be aware of, that there are lots of wildlife viewing opportunities there. And I think currently it's the neighbor has a canoe there, but we'll explore ways that other people might be able to access Northeast Creek by canoe at that site.
Wow, that'd be great.
Do you have plans for the house?
It's intended that probably an MCHG staff person will live in the house. Right now, we're prioritizing the work in the barn. We did put a new roof on the house and on the carriage house this past summer, so that's keeping things dry and buying us some time as we work on the barn. And then, yes, it's intended that someone will live in the house.
And one last comment we received, it would be great to have a marriage of the geological history that Tim shared with an interpretive signage from Maine Coast Heritage Trust to tell about the stones used in building the wall. So that's a great note from Tom Hayward. Thanks for our audience for being engaged and asking some really interesting questions. So I'm going to wrap us up for tonight. Thank you for joining us for Chebacco Chats. Our last episode of the year is next Thursday, December 15 at 4:30 p.m. I will be joined by Bill Horner for a chat about the Gilded Age of Yachting on MDI. Tim and Renee, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a really fun talk and very interesting. I'm looking forward to going back to the Stone Barn Farm now that I know a little bit more about the place.
Thanks for having us.
Jenna, yeah, thank you.
Of course. And to view Chebacco Chats after they air, everyone, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can visit the Chebacco Chats page on our website. Our annual journal Chebacco is published every spring, and it's mailed to members as a membership benefit. Please consider joining the Historical Society or renewing your membership for 2023 by visiting our website and going to our membership page. If you have any questions for me or other staff, just email us at info@mdihistory.org and we will be in touch. Have a good evening, and hopefully I will see you all next week. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.